That night I realized my husband wasn't alone in bed. In the ordinary world I had built out of schedules, small rituals, and the soft architecture of habit folded in on itself like a photograph left too long in the sun. I had come home from the late shift at the clinic with a thermos of coffee I never drank, the house already steeped in the low hum of the evening. The refrigerator's distant complaint, a sitcom laugh track dribbling from a muted TV in the living room, the faint domestic metallicness of cutlery in a sink that had been rinsed and left dry. He had texted 5 minutes before, home in tenny, and I had smiled at the tiny bubble of certainty that had sustained me for years, that he was someone who kept his promises, who called when trains were late, who cursed gently at small injustices like burned toast or missing socks. That night, I slipped off my shoes in the hall, the carpet familiar under my heels, and followed the trail of domestic sounds toward our bedroom, as if to confirm a small, harmless truth. The bed was not dark. There was a faint glow from a phone on the nightstand, the bedside lamp left on haphazardly, and the sheets were tangled in a way they had never been when it was only him and me. Too many folds, a texture of movement that suggested another presence. First, my brain tried to steady the image into banalities. The dog had burrowed in the covers he'd been reading, the lamp left on, because he was careless. And I heard a laugh, low, private, the kind that pulls at the edges of someone else's mouth and isn't mine, and the space between ribs where I kept my steadying breath hollowed out like a held note. My knees wanted to give. My hands did not climb to the bedside switch. They fumbled instead for the phone that had been in my pocket, a useless island of light, and I stood there, watching, as light pooled on skin that was not mine, listening to the cadence of a man I had loved for a decade as if it were foreign speech. The scene did not reconcile with the man who brought me flowers on bad days, the man who had learned to make my mother's favorite soup, the man who knew how I liked the thermostat set when winter pressed against the glass. It was a trivial, absolutist betrayal and an enormous existential rupture all at once. Anger rose slow, like bile, but what came first was a feral, ancient grief. The sense of being removed from authorship of my own life, the sudden evidence that the narrative I had trusted had been, in some crucial chapters, written without me. I left the hallway before thinking. I walked until the night air slapped some color back into my face and I could breathe like a person again. The world out there was stupidly indifferent. A neighbor's pendant lamp winked through curtains. A cat threaded itself between my ankles. A plane traced a faint silver line across a sky that might have been innocent. Not for the fact that betrayal had a way of resculpting the world to serve its own geometry. I drove aimlessly, hands clenched at the wheel. And in the metal quiet of my car, I began to map out what happened next not as a sequence of revenge moves, but as an inventory of rights I had to reclaim. For days I could not sleep. I watched him across the room like a scientist from another era might watch an animal in a cage. Cataloging, measuring, trying to locate the needle of reality in a haystack of excuses. He apologized the first morning with the cowardice of a man caught with his hand in the cookie jar. Small too fast, the apology of someone who wants to minimize damage rather than repair it. He had explanations. Loneliness, a trivial moment that had snowballed a mistake. The other woman, if she existed beyond the bedroom scene I'd caught, was a cipher he named with the blandness of a man who said names like brands. He asked forgiveness like a man bargaining for comfort. He offered to attend counseling like a man offering a bandage for a bone fracture. I listened to him while feeling the slow calcification of resolve. Forgiveness, if it was to be given, would not be my first currency. That would be reserved for truth. I am not an especially vindictive person by nature. My education and my family trained me in moderation, in the economist's ethics of weighing harm. But knowing where the line is and refusing to be crossed are different things. Betrayal rearranges moral furniture. It teaches you that you can be ethical and still act with precision. I set to work like a strategist, not a saboteur. First came documentation, not because I wanted to weaponize detail, but because memory is treacherous, and I could not afford to gamble on the porosity of human recollection. I started with the small things. A series of photographs taken on different mornings, his coffee cup left in the sink, a lipstick smear on the collar of his shirt. a receipt for a restaurant neither of us had frequented, each one a quiet proof against denial. I kept copies of messages, saved threads, and began to schedule moments of deliberate, controlled observation. In the middle of this, the strangest thing happened, the clarity that often follows the exposure of deception. When a lie is cut away, what remains becomes oddly vivid. I saw with uncomfortable precision the ways I had compromised for comfort, the dinners I'd skipped because he preferred to watch the game, the promotions I'd not chased because his schedule would have clashed. The quiet capitulations that accumulate into the architecture of one person's life yielding to another's habits. Revenge is always imagined as a single lightning strike in our popular imagination, an explosive public unmasking, but the work of reclaiming selfhood is not always spectacular. It is tactical. It is small acts that, when strung together, form an internal resistance. I began to perform the small defiance of an act reclaimed. I rewired morning. I put my favorite mug in the cupboard where he never looked, brewed tea instead of coffee, and began training for the early runs I had once postponed. I learned the names of authors he had scoffed at. I took back the playlist on our shared streaming account and filled it with songs that made my jaw unclench. I sold things that had become ours but always bore his imprint. The couch where our arguments had originated, the bedside lamp with a scratch from moving boxes the year we bought the house, and I kept photographically cataloged the receipts and notes that proved my ownership. Each small thing was not a spectacle. It was infrastructure. The reestablishment of boundaries, the quiet laying of bricks that said, "This life is mine to govern." He noticed. Of course he noticed, and he called my attention to it as if it were a provocation. "Is this about her?" he asked once with insolent curiosity. "No," I said, and for once the truth did not have to be cruel. "It's about me." When the initial frost of my shock thawed enough to let me plan I wanted could not be merely punitive, I wanted witness. I wanted him, and anyone who thought of him as they had in that room, to see the consequences of assuming a life could be taken and replaced without cost. I began to imagine the reveal like a painting. The lines had to be clear, the light dramatic but honest, the aftermath inevitable. I collected evidence not to brandish it at a party like a weapon, but to place it where it could be authenticated. Emails to his work account from the other woman. A string of messages that showed dates and times, invoices for hotel stays in cities where our lives had not taken us. I sent a copy to my lawyer, not because I sought to monetize pain, but because legal structure can be a kind of moral choreography that prevents lies from reconstituting themselves into the comfortable patterns that make betrayal possible. We talked about custody contingencies, about protecting savings, about the professional risks that could come from an exposure. He called the lawyer an escalation. I called it preemption. There were nights of ugly, wordless exchanges, him accusing me of looking for reasons, me refusing to be gaslit into believing that my senses had betrayed me. There were also moments of deep tenderness from people I had forgotten to notice. My sister's fierce, clumsy support, the neighbor who brought lasagna and stayed to talk as if to stitch the fabric of ordinary life. Those small, human interventions were the scaffolding on which my strategy could be built without me collapsing into vindictiveness. When I finally confronted him with the evidence laid out, clinical and plain, like exhibits in a courtroom, his face did a thing I had not quite expected. Something between shame and calculation, the look of a man realizing rates had changed. He offered charm as a defense mechanism and denial as a blanket. I refused both. I told him plainly that I would not sanctify his lies with the currency of forgiveness until a truth was spoken that resembled accountability. I orchestrated moments of exposure not for cruelty but for the precise function of erasing ambiguity. The first was small and private, a handwritten letter left on the kitchen table asking him to explain. The second was public, calibrated like a theater director's coupe. We were overdue for a family dinner, an awkward tradition of my in-laws that had always made me feel like an understudy in someone else's life, and I turned it into a stage. I did not shout. I did not throw things. Instead, I asked him to join us and brought with me the patience of a person who knows how to set a scene. When the dessert plate had been cleared and polite laughter had settled, I produced quietly the photographic and written breadcrumbs I had assembled. I read selections aloud, text with timestamps, photographs with dates, each line a small, precise argument. There is a peculiar power in the hush that follows a truth. It is a vacuum that pulls at the room's oxygen, pressing everyone into attention. He sputtered. My mother-in-law bristled. My father-in-law looked as if someone had whispered about a stain on the family's honor. People who had known me as the steady one heard for the first time how steady had been an accommodation not always chosen. The shame did not protect him. It did not always translate into repentance. But it created a record of witness, a network of people who had seen the evidence and had, therefore, become part of the moral ledger. Still, the point of revenge in my mind was not just to punish. There are easier, crueler paths. Exposure leading to permanent ruin, public shaming that leaves a scar rather than a lesson. I wanted to be smarter. I wanted him to understand the cost, but also to give myself a future where I could be free of performance. I arranged with the lawyer for a separation that protected our children's routine, preserved dignity where possible, and pooled resources to ensure we both had the means to rearrange our lives. He threatened, as many men do when faced with the sting of consequence, threatened to drag me into court, to tell alternate stories to excuse himself. I collected everything: bank statements, notes from therapists, evidence of the affair's timeline. The legal process is not always poetic. It is a grind, a series of signatures and sterile language around the intimacy of human failure. But there was a small triumph in seeing the script of our lives rewritten not by his unilateral choices, but by a process that recognized my rights. Revenge changed, as these things often do, into a reclamation of desire. I began to date in the slow, careful way of someone testing a muscle that had atrophied from disuse, not throwing it around with bravado. I returned to the things that had quietly meant me more than he had admitted. Morning runs that left me breathless in the limbs that had forgotten their own strength, a ceramic class where I would eventually make cups with slightly uneven rims that were beautifully mine. And nights where I read entire books in one sitting without feeling guilty about not sharing the ending with someone else. The anger that had lit me like a bonfire cooled into a fierce, dry resolve. I would not be the character in my story whose arc ended in resignation. There were, inevitably, scraps of bitterness. I would sometimes rehearse privately 1,000 small humiliations I might inflict in a world less constrained by civility. I kept those rehearsals like a child keeps stickers, a private delight not meant to unsettle the structural calm I was building. Disparate. People who watched the public parts of my life sometimes misunderstood the quietness of my response for passivity. They thought because I did not throw spectacular tantrums I had forgiven. Forgiveness is a complicated verb. It is not the absence of consequence. At its best, forgiveness is a reallocation of energy away from the offense and toward personal flourishing. I chose to forgive only when it seemed a generous use of my own resources, not because pity or despair demanded. There were nights, of course, when I would lay awake and imagine alternate lives, paths not taken because I had prioritized marriage over study or comfort over exploration. Those reveries were not a breakdown. They were a catalog of potential futures I could now choose with the blunt instrument of experience. In time, the man who had been unfaithful moved out. We rearranged the house like people moving into separate apartments under the same roof, different linens, different mugs, a deliberate, ceremonial detachment. The neighbors adjusted their gaze. Mutual friends took sides, and the social map I had taken for granted redrew itself with jagged kindnesses. There were slights and small cruelties from people who had loved him first and could not bear to accommodate the unglamorous fact of his failure. But there were also offers of support from unexpected corners. The barista who slipped an extra cookie into my bag. The coworker who covered a late shift without being asked. Those mundane acts of mercy accumulated into a quiet architecture of belonging that had nothing to do with marriage. I thought of revenge sometimes as a ledger. In the end, it was a recalibration of value. He had taken from me the illusion of safety. I took back the sovereignty of my days. The affair's stain did not erase itself like a candle flame extinguished with water. It left edges. There were memories that the children would ask about in later years, unsettling, truncated conversations that required honesty without adult brutality. We learned how to talk, sometimes clumsily, about human failure and the idea that adults are not always morally coherent. In those conversations, I tried to instill a lesson that had been expensive to learn, that love is not a property, and that fidelity is a series of daily choices, not a single state. My children's trust in me was not the casualty I had feared. Rather, it was my failure that taught them that people can fail and still be held accountable, and that the price of liberty sometimes involves painful negotiation. Years later, when the gash of betrayal had scarred over into a line that could be pointed at and told as story, I understood that revenge had not been about spectacle. It had been about the reclamation of my narrative voice, telling the truth about what happened and insisting on a future where my instincts would shape choices rather than the shadow of another's betrayal. I remarried eventually, not to erase the past, but to assert that hope can be rebuilt in new scaffolding. When I look back now, I see the trajectory not as a linear tale of vengeance, but as the messy human labor of reclaiming dignity. The bed that night had been crowded with another's presence. Yes, but it had also revealed a truth I needed, that the life I had been given was not a finished book whose margins I could not alter. It was and remains an ongoing draft, if one must call it that. Was the discipline of editing with skill and care, refusing cheap theatrics and instead investing in the durable work of rebuilding. I did not break him. I did not break him. I did not enact spectacular ruin. I reclaimed myself in small, unshowy increments that together amounted to a life that no longer required his permission to exist.